I woke up with a jolt, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep so abruptly. The room around me was bathed in darkness, thick and oppressive, as if the night itself had swallowed everything. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes, and instinctively reached for the small digital clock on my nightstand. The soft red glow illuminated the numbers. 3 a.m. I stared at the clock, waiting for the seconds to change, for the small tick that would signal the passage of time. But nothing happened. The numbers remained frozen, unmoving. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the clock had stopped working. Maybe the battery was low. But then I noticed the silence. A deep, unnerving quiet had settled over the house. It wasn't just the usual nighttime stillness. This was different. There was no sound of the wind outside, no distant hum of cars passing by on the street, no creak of the old house settling. It was as if the world outside had come to a complete halt. I sat up slowly, my skin prickling with unease. Something was wrong. My phone sat beside the clock, and I grabbed it, hoping it would offer some clarity. The screen lit up, bright against the darkness, but my stomach twisted as I saw the same time displayed on the screen. 3 a.m. No movement, no change. I locked and unlocked it again, but the numbers remained frozen. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "It's just a glitch," I whispered to myself, hoping the sound of my own voice would calm me. But the dread in my chest only grew. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold wood floor beneath my feet. Maybe I was still dreaming. That had to be it. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. The street was deserted, not unusual for this time of night, but there was something off about the way the world looked. The trees stood motionless, not a single leaf stirring in the breeze. The air itself felt heavy, as if it too had frozen in time. I let the curtain fall back into place, my fingers trembling. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered, but the quiet only seemed to press in harder, thickening with every passing moment. My heart thudded in my chest, and I forced myself to walk toward the bedroom door. Maybe if I moved, if I did something, the world would start turning again. The hallway outside my room was just as dark and silent as the bedroom. I stepped forward cautiously, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The stillness followed me, clinging to the air, making every step feel heavier than the last. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening for any sign of life in the house. Nothing. Not even the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen below. I descended the stairs slowly, gripping the banister as I moved. Each step seemed to echo in the silence, the sound too loud, too sharp against the oppressive quiet. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated, peering into the living room. The room was empty, just as I'd left it before going to bed. The furniture sat in its usual place, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights outside. But something was wrong. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was waiting for something. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the space. Then I saw it. The armchair by the window. It had been moved. Just slightly, barely enough to notice, but I knew it hadn't been like that before. I stood there, frozen, staring at the chair, trying to remember if I had accidentally bumped into it earlier, or if maybe I had moved it without thinking. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't touched it. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The house felt wrong, like it was watching me, waiting for me to notice. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move again. I walked slowly into the living room, my eyes never leaving the chair. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out and touched the back of it. Cold. The fabric was cold, like it had been sitting outside in the night air for hours. I pulled my hand back, my skin tingling with unease. The silence pressed in again, heavier this time, almost suffocating. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was still dreaming, but then I heard it, a soft creak coming from the kitchen. The sound was faint, barely audible, but in the stillness of the house it might as well have been a scream. My body tensed, and I stood frozen in place, listening. The creak came again, louder this time. Something was moving. In the kitchen. The sound echoed again from the kitchen, louder this time, breaking through the oppressive silence. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood there, frozen, staring at the darkened hallway. Something was in the house. I could feel it now. A presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting in the shadows. I forced myself to move, my legs shaky as I inched toward the kitchen. Every step felt heavier than the last, the quiet pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I stopped at the doorway, my hand resting on the frame, the air around me thick and cold. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering in through the small window above the sink. Everything looked normal. The countertops were clear, the chairs neatly tucked under the table, the fridge humming quietly in the corner. But the air felt different, colder, almost suffocating. And then I saw it. The drawer. One of the kitchen drawers was open, just a crack, but enough for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I hadn't left it open. I hadn't even used that drawer in days. Slowly I approached it, my pulse quickening with each step. The stillness of the house seemed to grow heavier, the silence ringing in my ears. I reached for the drawer, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open fully. The sound was too loud in the quiet house, and I winced as the wood scraped against the metal tracks. Inside, everything was in place. Forks, knives, spoons, all neatly arranged just as I had left them. But then I noticed something odd. The knives. One of them was missing. I stared at the empty slot where the knife should have been, my mind racing. Someone had taken it. Someone had been in the house, moving things, watching me. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I backed away from the drawer, my hands shaking. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of movement, but the kitchen remained still. The air felt suffocating now, pressing down on me, and I could feel the weight of the silence growing heavier with each passing second. And then I heard it, a soft creak, like footsteps coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The hallway was empty, just as I had left it, but the sound had been real. I had heard it, unmistakable in the stillness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood there, staring into the darkness beyond the kitchen, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the countertop. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. The house wasn't just quiet, it was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I glanced at the clock on the wall, half expecting it to have started ticking again, but the hands were still frozen at 3 a.m. Time wasn't moving, nothing was moving. Except for the thing in the house with me. I needed to get out. The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I backed toward the door, my eyes never leaving the darkened hallway. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers shaking as I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I pulled harder, twisting the lock, but the door remained firmly in place, as if the house itself was refusing to let me leave. My breath came in ragged gasps now, my chest tight with fear. I glanced back toward the hallway, the shadows looming larger, darker, like they were closing in around me. The creaking sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was moving closer, step by step. I grabbed my phone from the countertop, desperate to call for help, but when I unlocked the screen, the time still read 3 a.m. No signal, no connection. I was completely cut off. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as I backed further into the kitchen, my mind racing. I couldn't escape. I was trapped, and whatever was in the house with me was getting closer. I glanced around the kitchen, searching for something, anything, that I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on the missing knife. It was somewhere in the house. But where? And who had taken it? The creaking footsteps grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the presence now, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I gripped the edge of the countertop, my knuckles white, as I braced myself for whatever was about to happen. And then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow everything around me. I stood frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A shadow, just at the edge of the doorway, standing perfectly still. I stood there, frozen, staring at the shadowy figure at the edge of the doorway. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening with fear. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel it watching me. The air around me was cold, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, as if it was alive, breathing with the same rhythm as the figure in the doorway. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. My legs felt like lead, my feet glued to the floor. The figure was still there, just beyond the reach of the light, its form barely visible, but its presence overwhelming. I didn't know what it was, or what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't human. Time had stopped. The clock was still stuck at 3 a.m., and the world outside remained frozen. No wind, no sound, no movement. Just me, the house, and this thing that was standing between me and any hope of escape. The silence was unbearable. My pulse thundered in my ears as I waited, every second stretching into eternity. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it getting closer, inching toward me with every heartbeat, even though its form remained perfectly still. I clenched my hands into fists, trying to ground myself, to force my body to do something, anything. But the fear had taken over. I was trapped, helpless, and the house knew it. Whatever was inside, whatever had taken over this place, it was toying with me, dragging out the terror, waiting for me to crack. I took a step back, my feet dragging across the cold floor. The movement felt sluggish, as if time itself was thickening around me. I glanced at the clock again, desperately hoping for some change. Some sign that this nightmare was about to end, but the numbers remained frozen. 3 a.m. Suddenly, the figure shifted. A subtle, barely perceptible movement, but enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the countertop with a dull thud. The shadow at the doorway seemed to pulse, expanding slightly, as though it was preparing to come forward. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its presence pressing down on me, growing heavier with each passing second. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. The fear was suffocating, consuming me, and I knew I couldn't stand here any longer. I turned and bolted toward the hallway, my feet slipping on the slick floor as I ran. The house seemed to stretch around me, the walls closing in as I sprinted for the stairs. I could hear the creaking behind me again, those slow, deliberate footsteps, following me up the stairs, matching my pace. I reached the top, breathless, and threw myself into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My back hit the door as I slid to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still dark, the clock beside my bed still stuck at 3 a.m. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to calm myself, but the cold, oppressive air followed me. I could still feel it, its presence, hovering just beyond the door. The footsteps had stopped again, but the silence was even worse. It was waiting for me, and I knew it wouldn't be long before it found a way in. I reached for my phone, desperate for some connection to the outside world, but it was useless. The screen showed 3 a.m., frozen in time just like everything else. No signal, no way out. The doorknob rattled. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the sound echoed through the room. Slowly, deliberately, the door creaked open, the dark hallway beyond stretching out like a void. I couldn't see anything, no figure, no shadow, but I knew it was there, just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I stood up, my legs trembling, and backed away from the door. My eyes darted to the clock, hoping for some miracle, but the hands remained frozen, as if mocking me. The air in the room felt colder, heavier, and I could feel the presence seeping into the room, filling every corner, every shadow. I backed into the far wall, my hands trembling as I stared at the open doorway. The house was silent again, but the oppressive stillness was worse than the footsteps. It was as if the house itself had become a trap, a prison, designed to keep me locked inside this endless moment. I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts, to think of a way out. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no way out. Time had stopped, and so had I. And then, in the quiet, I heard it again. "Sarah." The whisper was soft, barely more than a breath, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. My eyes flew open, and I stared at the dark doorway, my heart racing. The figure was standing there, just beyond the threshold, watching me. I took a step back, my body trembling, my breath shallow. The clock remained frozen. 3 a.m. The world outside was still locked in time, and the figure in the doorway was closer now, its presence growing stronger, more tangible. I backed into the corner of the room, my pulse thundering in my ears as the shadow seemed to move forward, inch by inch. I could feel it now, its cold, suffocating presence pressing against me, pulling me into the endless night. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stopped. The room fell silent. Time had stopped, and I was still trapped in the frozen hour. I moved into the house 2 weeks ago, and in that time, I had started to adjust to the quiet. It wasn't like living in the city where the hum of traffic and the constant buzz of people was a backdrop to everyday life. Here, in the suburbs, it was different. The silence was heavy, almost too much sometimes, as if the world outside had gone completely still. But I needed this. After the divorce, after everything, I needed a break, a fresh start. The house was old, but it had a certain charm that I liked. High ceilings, hardwood floors that creaked underfoot, and windows that let in just enough sunlight during the day. It was cozy, a bit worn in places, but it felt like mine. I'd spent my first few nights unpacking, getting everything in order, and settling into a routine. Work was steady, and at night, I'd enjoy the peace and quiet. But then there was the sound. At first, I barely noticed it. It was so faint, just a low, irregular breath that I'd hear when the house was especially quiet. I thought it was nothing. Maybe the wind slipping through the old windows, or the way the house settled at night. The kind of noises you expect in an old place like this. I brushed it off as background noise. But the more time I spent alone, the more I noticed it. That soft, uneven breathing. Almost like it was coming from the next room over. I'd be sitting in the living room, the TV on low, and I'd catch it. A faint exhale that wasn't mine. It was barely audible, but once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I'd mute the TV, listen hard, and for a moment, there'd be nothing. Silence. But then, after a few seconds, there it was again. The same low, irregular breath. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe I was just getting used to the new house, to the different sounds it made. After all, living alone wasn't something I'd done in years. But something about the sound felt off. It wasn't just random creaks or groans from the old floors or walls. It was deliberate, like someone else was breathing in the house with me. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, and I'd hear it again. The breath. It was closer now, almost like it was coming from inside the room. I'd turn over, pull the covers tighter, try to drown it out with my own breathing, but the sound persisted. Low, steady, and just out of reach. I'd hold my breath, hoping it was just in my head, but the house would go still, and in the quiet, the breath would return. I told myself it was the house settling. That's what houses do, right? They settle. They breathe, in their own way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. One night, the breath came again, louder this time, as if someone was standing right next to me. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, eyes scanning the room. The darkness was thick, the corners of the room swallowed by shadows, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet and then the breath. I held my breath, trying to listen, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed to move, shifting from one side of the room to the other. I flicked on the light, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it. My clothes were draped over the chair by the window. The door was shut, the hallway beyond quiet. I got up, checking every corner of the room, opening the closet, peeking under the bed. Nothing, just me, alone in the house. I stood there for a moment, the light bright and harsh after the darkness, feeling foolish. Of course, there was no one here. It was just the house, just the wind, or the pipes, or something else entirely explainable. But as I turned off the light and climbed back into bed, the breath came again, soft and steady, like a reminder that I wasn't alone after all. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I went about my day as usual, made coffee, sat at my desk to work, ignored the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. But the breath lingered in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe I wasn't imagining things. Maybe I wasn't alone in this house. That night, as I sat in the living room, the breath came again. This time, it felt closer, more deliberate. I muted the TV and listened hard, my heart racing in my chest. The house was quiet, too quiet, and then there it was. The sound was unmistakable now, a low, irregular breath, soft but constant, like someone was standing just out of sight. I stood up, moving slowly through the house, my ears straining for the sound. I checked the front door, the windows, even the back door. Everything was locked. There was no sign of anyone else in the house, but the sound continued, always just ahead of me, always just out of reach. The unease that had been growing inside me for days finally broke through. I wasn't imagining this. There was something here, something I couldn't explain. And the more I listened, the more I realized the breath was getting closer. The next few nights were unbearable. The breath, the soft, low exhale was everywhere. It no longer mattered where I was in the house. I could hear it, constant and unsettling. It followed me from room to room, never quite fading, always just out of sight. And the worst part? It seemed to be getting closer. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was all in my head, that I was just paranoid. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time I sat down to relax, the breathing would start, soft at first, barely audible, and then it would build, becoming louder, more pronounced. No matter how much I tried to drown it out with the TV or music, it was always there, lingering in the background like an unwanted guest. One night, after yet another restless evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I was done pretending that everything was normal. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen, determined to find the source of the sound. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant breathing, the feeling of being watched. I had to know what was happening in my house. I started in the living room, scanning every corner with the beam of light. My heart raced in my chest as I moved from room to room, the flashlight cutting through the shadows. The house was deathly quiet, but the breathing never stopped. It was softer now, more distant, but I could still hear it. No matter where I pointed the light, there was nothing. Just empty rooms, bare walls, and the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the silence. But the breath followed. It was in the kitchen, behind me as I opened cupboards and checked beneath the sink. It was in the hallway, just beyond my reach as I crept along the walls. I checked every door, every window, but nothing was out of place. The house was locked up tight, no sign of anyone or anything that could be making that sound. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I found myself back in the living room, staring at the darkened windows, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The breath was there, right behind me, so close now that I could almost feel it on my skin. My pulse quickened as I spun around, shining the light into every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing, just the emptiness of the house staring back at me. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. The house was quiet again, but the silence was too thick, too heavy. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the very air was suffocating me. The breathing was gone, but I knew it was just a matter of time before it returned. The next day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Work passed in a blur, and all I could think about was the house, about that sound, that terrible, haunting sound. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. Every time I tried to focus, I felt it creeping closer, as if it was following me, even outside the house. I wanted to believe that I was losing my mind, that this was just some trick my brain was playing on me, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the breathing to start again. And, like clockwork, it did. It was soft at first, just a whisper of a sound, barely noticeable. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent. The air felt colder, heavier, and I could feel the breath moving closer. It wasn't coming from outside the room anymore. It was here, inside with me. I sat up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The room was dark, but I could feel it. The presence of something else, something unseen. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, flicking it on with trembling hands. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing to see. The room was empty, just like before. But the breathing hadn't stopped. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and began checking the room. Under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains, everywhere. I searched every possible hiding spot, desperate to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the soft, steady breathing, like it was right next to me, but invisible. I stood in the middle of the room, panting, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just the house, I told myself. Maybe it was just the way old buildings creak and groan at night. But as I stood there, gripping the flashlight, I heard it again, louder this time, more distinct, and it was coming from the other side of the door. I froze. The breath was right there on the other side, so close that I could almost feel it seeping through the crack at the bottom. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took a step back, staring at the door, terrified of what might be behind it. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know, but I had to. Slowly, my hand reached for the doorknob. My fingers trembled as I turned it, the metal cold under my touch. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever I might find, and then in one swift motion, I yanked the door open. There was nothing. The hallway beyond was empty, just like before. The breath had stopped, but as I stood there staring into the darkness, I knew it wasn't over. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the air felt thick with tension, like something was waiting just out of sight. I stepped into the hallway, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The breathing was gone, but I could still feel it, like it was just ahead of me, leading me deeper into the house. I followed it, my heart pounding, knowing that the next time I heard it, it might be too late. The hallway stretched out before me, darker and more foreboding than ever. Every step I took felt like I was walking into the unknown, and with every step the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. The flashlight flickered in my trembling hand, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, but it wasn't just my breath that I could hear. The breathing had returned. It started again, low and slow, coming from somewhere ahead of me, just beyond the reach of the light. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears as I listened intently. The sound was unmistakable now, soft, irregular breaths, like someone trying to remain quiet but not quite succeeding. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something real. I had spent days trying to convince myself that this wasn't happening, that it was all in my head. But now, standing in the dark hallway, with the breathing so close, there was no more denying it. Someone, or something, was in the house with me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead, and forced my legs to move. The flashlight beam wavered as I advanced, its weak glow barely cutting through the thick shadows that clung to the walls. I reached the end of the hallway, where the entrance to the basement loomed like a black hole in the floor. The breathing was louder now, coming from below. It was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and irregular, as though someone was struggling to control it. My heart raced as I stood there, staring down into the darkness of the basement. I had always avoided going down there, convincing myself that it was just an old, unused space, but now I knew I had no choice. I had to go down. My hands trembled as I reached for the basement light switch, flicking it on. Nothing happened. The bulb had gone out, leaving only the weak beam of the flashlight to guide me. My stomach twisted with fear, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt damp and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But as I reached the bottom, I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been down here. Recently, the breathing was louder now, echoing off the concrete walls. I swept the flashlight across the room, illuminating old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and cobwebs hanging in the corners. But there was no sign of anyone. I took a step forward, my heart pounding harder with each breath. The sound was so close now, as if the person, whoever it was standing right next to me, hidden in the shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A bedroll, crumpled and dirty, tucked behind a stack of old boxes. Beside it, a half-eaten sandwich sat on a plate, and scattered around were small personal belongings, a comb, a book, a flashlight of their own. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. Someone had been living down here, in my house, all this time. I stepped closer, my heart racing as the flashlight beam swept over the makeshift bed. The breathing continued, low and labored, coming from the darkness behind the boxes. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were there, just out of sight, watching me. I could feel their presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the air. My throat tightened as fear gripped me. This was no longer about a noise in the night. There was someone here. They had been hiding in the basement, watching me, moving around when I wasn't looking. The thought made my skin crawl. How long had they been here? How close had I come to them without even knowing? I stepped back, my mind racing. I needed to leave. Now. I couldn't stay in this house any longer, not with whoever or whatever was down here. But as I turned to leave, the breathing grew louder, more frantic. I froze, my body stiffening as I realized that the person, the thing, was moving. Suddenly, a figure lunged out from behind the boxes. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor, plunging the basement into darkness. My heart raced as I scrambled to pick it up. The sound of the breathing, now erratic, chaotic, like someone or something, was right on top of me. My fingers closed around the flashlight, and I flicked it back on, the beam wildly illuminating the walls. There was nothing. The room was empty again, just as it had been when I arrived. But I knew what I had seen. The presence was still there, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. I backed away, my chest tight with fear, the air around me thick and stifling. The breathing had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. The house was still, too still, and I could feel it, the presence, lingering, waiting for me to make a move. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest as I reached the top. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. But even as I stood there, breathless, staring at the door, I knew it wasn't enough. The house was no longer a home. It had become a prison, and something was inside, waiting for me. I grabbed my keys from the table and ran for the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. But just as I was about to leave, I heard it again. The breathing. It was right behind me. When I first received the letter, I thought it was a joke. I hadn't spoken to any of my extended family in years, and the idea of inheriting a house from some distant relative I barely remembered seemed absurd. But there it was, my name, written in formal legal script, declaring that I, Laura Carter, was now the sole owner of an old estate in the rural countryside. Apparently it had belonged to my great-uncle, a man I had never met nor heard of. I debated ignoring the letter, but something about it stuck with me. The timing couldn't have been better. My life was in shambles, and the idea of escaping the city, escaping my past, was tempting. So, after weeks of hesitation, I packed up what little I had and drove to the address in the letter, hoping for a fresh start. The drive was long, winding through forests and remote stretches of land. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. The house stood at the end of a narrow gravel path, hidden behind a line of dense trees. It was bigger than I expected, with tall stone walls and ivy creeping up the sides, a relic of a time long past. I stepped out of the car, taking in the sight of it. There was something imposing about the house, something heavy in the air, but I brushed it off as nerves. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. The city had been loud, chaotic. This was the complete opposite. The quiet was almost deafening. Unlocking the front door, I stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking beneath my feet. The house smelled of dust and age, the kind of scent that clung to old books and forgotten furniture. It was dark, even with the fading light outside, and as I fumbled for a light switch, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The living room was grand, with high ceilings and a large fireplace. Old paintings hung on the walls, their subjects long forgotten, staring down at me with cold, indifferent eyes. I made my way through the house, exploring the kitchen, the bedrooms, the long hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. Everything was in surprisingly good condition, but there was an emptiness to it, a silence that felt unnatural. I tried to settle in, unpacking a few things and making myself a quick dinner. The kitchen was functional enough, though outdated, and I found myself appreciating the peace and quiet. It had been a long time since I'd been alone, truly alone, without the constant noise of the city or the distractions of everyday life. That first night, as I lay in bed, the wind howling outside, I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft murmur, like distant voices carried by the wind. I dismissed it, pulling the covers tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the longer I lay there, the more distinct the sound became. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something inside the house. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the walls, low, indistinct whispers, as though someone was speaking just out of earshot. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses made strange noises all the time. But these whispers, they felt different, intentional. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept toward the hallway. The whispers followed me, growing louder as I moved closer to the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold stone, and for a moment I could almost make out the words. My name. They were whispering my name. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. It wasn't possible. I was alone. No one else was in the house. I rushed back to my room, slamming the door behind me, as if that could somehow block out the sound. But the whispers didn't stop. They were faint, almost teasing, but I could hear them, calling to me, urging me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers seemed to get louder, closer, as if they were seeping through the walls, invading my thoughts. By the time the sun began to rise, I was exhausted, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. What had I gotten myself into? The next day I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me throughout the house, faint at first, then growing louder as the day wore on. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching me, speaking to me. And the worst part was, the whispers knew things. Things I had never told anyone. By the time night fell again, I was on edge, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. I tried to distract myself, reading through some old papers I found in the study, but the whispers wouldn't let me focus. They were louder now, more insistent, and the things they said, they weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands. The second night was worse. I hadn't even unpacked completely, and already I was regretting my decision to stay. The whispers that had haunted me the night before returned with a vengeance, louder, clearer, and more disturbing. It wasn't just my name they were calling now. It was my thoughts, my memories, spoken back to me in twisted, distorted tones. I tried to keep myself busy during the day, exploring more of the house and its surrounding property. I found an old garden in the back, overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. It must have been beautiful once, but now it was just another reminder of how long this house had been abandoned. I spent hours trying to clear it, my hands covered in dirt and scratches by the time I was done. But even out there, away from the stone walls, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. The whispers had gotten inside my head. I could hear them, faintly, even in the garden. They echoed in my thoughts, like they were a part of me now, seeping into the quiet moments when I let my guard down. By the time the sun began to set, the unease in my chest had grown into a knot of fear. I didn't want to go back inside, but I had no choice. As I stepped through the front door, the heavy silence of the house greeted me like an old friend. The air inside was thick, stifling, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread that clung to me as I moved from room to room. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that old houses made noise, that I was just tired and stressed, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The whispers were real. By the time night fell, I was already on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on fire. I sat in the living room trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, to the shadows that seemed to grow darker as the minutes passed. And then, the whispers started again. At first, they were faint, just like the night before. Low murmurs, barely audible, but they were there, winding through the walls like a dark current. I ignored them at first, trying to focus on the book in my hands, but it was no use. The words on the page blurred as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were telling me things. Things I didn't want to hear. You can't hide from us, Laura. We know your secrets. We know what you've done. I dropped the book, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, hidden in the shadows, but I was alone. The whispers continued, swirling around me, filling my head with dark, unsettling thoughts. I tried to shut them out, pressing my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just outside, they were inside me now. I stumbled to my feet, my pulse racing as I tried to catch my breath. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick and suffocating. I needed to get out, to get away from the voices. I rushed toward the front door, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't turn. The door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I checked the windows, the back door, but they were all the same. Locked, sealed tight, as if the house itself was holding me prisoner. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, telling me to do things, to act on the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Stop fighting, Laura. Let go. You know you want to. Don't you feel it? The rage, the hate. It's been inside you all along. I backed away from the door, my breathing shallow, my hands shaking. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were thoughts. My thoughts. They spoke with my voice, urging me, pushing me to let go of the control I had so desperately tried to maintain. I wanted to scream, to tear the walls down, but I was too afraid. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me, as if that could keep the voices out. But they followed, seeping through the cracks, louder than ever. They told me things, terrible things. They whispered about the people who had wronged me, about the pain I had tried to bury, the anger I had ignored. They told me that I didn't have to fight it anymore, that I could finally give in to the darkness I had tried so hard to deny. My hands trembled as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to push the voices out of my head. But they wouldn't stop. They knew my weaknesses, my fears, my regrets, and they used them against me. You deserve this. You're not weak, Laura. Let us in. The worst part was, a part of me wanted to listen. The anger was real. The hate was real. I had spent so much time pushing it down, pretending it didn't exist, but the house knew. It had pulled the darkness out of me, forced me to confront it, and now the whispers were telling me to stop fighting, to embrace it. I looked around the room, my vision blurring as the whispers grew louder, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were screams. Let us in! I clutched my head, trying to drown out the sound, but it was useless. The voices were inside me now, and there was no escaping them. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, the house felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The whispers had faded into the background, but I knew they hadn't gone away. They were waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to come back at any moment. And when they did, I wasn't sure I would be able to fight them. I tried to get out of bed, but my body felt sluggish, like I was moving through thick, invisible fog. My thoughts were muddled, clouded by exhaustion and fear. Everything seemed distant, disconnected, like I wasn't fully awake. But the house was awake. I could feel it. The whispers started again as soon as I stepped out of the bedroom. Low, persistent, winding through the walls like a dark current. They weren't screaming anymore, but they were clear, direct. They knew I was close to breaking. They could feel it. You can't fight it, Laura. You belong to us. I stumbled down the hallway, clutching my head as the voices grew louder. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to move, to get away from the suffocating weight of the whispers. But there was nowhere to go. The house was sealed tight, every door locked, every window closed. I was trapped, and the whispers knew it. I found myself in the library, surrounded by old, dusty books and forgotten memories. The room was dark, the heavy curtains blocking out what little light remained outside. I stood there, my heart racing, as the whispers circled around me, mocking me, taunting me. We know what you've done, Laura. You can't hide from us. I grabbed a book from one of the shelves and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the room, filling my head. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house, disappearing into the walls like everything else. My hands trembled as I backed into the desk, my mind spinning. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers wouldn't stop. The house wouldn't let me leave. And the worst part was, a part of me didn't want to leave. A part of me wanted to stay, to give in, to embrace the darkness that had been growing inside me since the moment I stepped foot in this cursed place. I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the wall as the whispers closed in around me. I could hear them in every corner of the room, in every creak of the floorboards, in every breath I took. They were inside me now, no longer just a distant echo. They were a part of me. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard something else. Something faint, but real. Footsteps. Someone was in the house. For a moment, I thought it was a trick, just another cruel game the whispers were playing. but the sound was too clear, too distinct. Someone, or something, was moving through the hallway, coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting to the door. The footsteps stopped just outside the library, and for a moment, the whispers fell silent. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening, and then the door creaked open. I held my breath, waiting, but no one stepped inside. The hallway beyond was empty, swallowed by shadows, but I knew someone or something was there. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the threshold. I backed away, my heart racing, as the whispers returned, louder than before. "Let them in, Laura. You know who it is." I shook my head, my hands trembling. "No," I whispered. "I won't do this. I'm not crazy." But the whispers wouldn't stop. They circled around me, relentless, driving me toward the door. I could feel my resolve crumbling, my grip on reality slipping away. The darkness inside me was growing stronger, more powerful. I couldn't fight it any longer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. "Let them in!" I stumbled toward the door, my vision blurring, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for the doorknob, and as soon as my fingers touched the cold metal, the house seemed to come alive. The walls pulsed with energy, the floor trembling beneath my feet. The whispers were everywhere, inside and out, filling my head, filling the house. I twisted the doorknob and pulled the door open, and there he was. A man stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He looked like he had been running, his clothes disheveled, his breath coming in short bursts. For a moment we just stared at each other, both frozen by the sudden silence that filled the house. And then he spoke. "Laura, what have you done?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The whispers were gone, but the darkness was still there, inside me, consuming me. I stepped back, my hands trembling, as the man took a step forward, his eyes locked on mine. "What did you do?" he repeated, his voice shaking. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, what the house had done to me. All I knew was that it was over. The fight was over. I had given in. The man reached for me, but I backed away, shaking my head. "No," I whispered. "It's too late." The house creaked around us, the walls closing in. I could feel it, the weight of the darkness, the pull of the whispers, drawing me deeper into the void. The man shouted something, but I couldn't hear him. The world was fading, swallowed by the house, by the shadows. And then, just like that, the whispers returned. They weren't whispers anymore. They were a part of me. When I first saw the house, it was like something out of an old photograph, frozen in time, almost untouched by the world around it. It stood at the end of a gravel path, surrounded by tall, ancient trees that seemed to loom over it like silent sentinels. The real estate agent had called it charming and full of potential, but there was something about it that felt heavy. Still, I needed a change, and this house, with its weathered bricks and ivy-covered walls, felt like the fresh start I was looking for. I had just gone through the most difficult year of my life. My job was suffocating, my relationship had crumbled, and every corner of the city seemed to remind me of failures I was desperate to leave behind. Moving to a small, quiet town where no one knew me seemed like the right choice. I told myself it was time to put the past behind me, to build something new. And this house, with its creaking floors and dusty corners, would be my sanctuary. The first few days were uneventful, mostly spent unpacking and getting familiar with the layout. It was an old house built in the early 1900s, with high ceilings, tall windows, and thick wooden doors. The floors creaked with every step, and the air had that faint smell of age, like old books and forgotten memories. There was something comforting about its quietness, the way the walls seemed to hold stories from a time long gone. At night, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees outside. On the third day, I noticed the first odd thing. It was small, something that could easily be explained away. I had left a stack of books on the dining room table the night before, planning to organize them later. When I came downstairs in the morning, the books had been moved. They weren't in a neat pile anymore. Instead, they were scattered across the table as if someone had been flipping through them. I paused, staring at the books, trying to remember if I had knocked them over without realizing it. Maybe I had been tired and careless. I picked them up, shrugged it off, and went about my day. But then it happened again. This time it wasn't the books. I had left the kitchen in perfect order before going to bed. Plates washed and put away, counters wiped clean. But the next morning, I found the kitchen in disarray. A cabinet door was left wide open, and the silverware drawer was pulled halfway out. It was subtle, but enough to make me feel uneasy. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. No sign of a break-in. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. A few more days passed without incident, and I started to relax again, convincing myself that everything was fine. It was an old house, after all. Old houses creaked, things shifted. It wasn't anything supernatural, just the normal sounds of a place this old settling in. But then one night, I heard it. It was late, maybe around midnight. I had been lying in bed, the soft hum of the wind outside helping me drift off. Just as I was about to fall asleep, a sound jolted me awake. It was faint at first, like a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. I lay there, listening, my breath caught in my throat. There it was again, a low murmur, like someone speaking from the other side of the wall. I sat up, my heart pounding. The house was silent, except for the wind. But the whisper had been real. I wasn't imagining it. I got out of bed and walked to the hallway, trying to find the source of the sound. I stood there in the darkness, listening. But the house was still. Maybe it had been a dream. I was tired, stressed. It was easy to hear things that weren't really there. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house, which had felt so comforting before, now seemed different. The air felt colder, heavier. I went back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. There were parts of it I hadn't fully examined yet, rooms I had left untouched since moving in. I started with the attic. The stairs leading up to it were narrow and steep, the wood groaning under my weight as I climbed. When I opened the door at the top, a rush of cold air hit me. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small, dust-covered window on the far wall. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. The attic was filled with old furniture, covered in white sheets, and boxes stacked haphazardly in the corners. It smelled of dust and decay. As I moved through the space, I noticed something strange. There was a faint outline on the floor, like someone had dragged something heavy across it recently. I crouched down, running my fingers along the marks, my mind racing. Who had been up here? That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the sound. It was like someone was standing just outside my room, speaking softly, just out of reach. My body froze as the whispers continued, growing louder, closer. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the house. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house. The whispers had been too clear, too persistent to ignore, but I didn't know what to do. I hadn't seen anyone, and there was no logical explanation for what I was hearing. Every time I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an overactive imagination, the memory of those whispers would creep back into my mind. The next morning, the house felt different. It was subtle at first. The air was colder, and there was an odd stillness to everything, like the house was waiting for something to happen. Even the sunlight that streamed through the windows seemed dimmer, as if it were struggling to pierce through some invisible gloom that had settled over the place. I decided to search the house more thoroughly, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. I started with the rooms on the ground floor, opening every door, checking every corner, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race. Nothing seemed out of place, but the silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. The only sound was my own breathing, echoing off the walls. By the time I reached the dining room, I was on edge. The room was exactly as I had left it the night before, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as I stood there, scanning the room, my eyes landed on the far wall. One of the paintings, a large, heavy portrait of a man I didn't recognize, was tilted slightly to the side. It had been perfectly straight the last time I'd seen it. I walked over to it, my footsteps slow and deliberate, and reached up to straighten the frame. The moment my fingers touched the cold, dusty surface, I felt it again. The whisper. It was soft, like before, just barely audible, but it was there. It was coming from behind the wall. I froze, my hand still on the frame. The whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent, but I still couldn't make out the words. It was like someone was trapped inside the walls, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I pulled my hand back, stumbling away from the painting, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to run, to get out of the house and never come back. But something held me there. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand why the house felt alive, like it was watching me, listening to me. That night, the whispers grew louder. They didn't wait for me to fall asleep this time. As soon as the sun went down and the house was bathed in darkness, the whispers began, creeping through the walls, slipping into my room like an unwelcome visitor. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, listening as the sound grew closer, louder, until it felt like the walls themselves were breathing. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the house settling, just the wind howling through the cracks. But then I heard it, clearer than ever before, a voice, a single word, "Come." I jumped out of bed, my entire body shaking with fear. The voice was different this time, direct, commanding. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. Someone or something was calling me. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. But nothing happened. The house was still, silent, as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. And I did. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was tired of being afraid, or maybe the house had finally gotten under my skin. But I walked toward the door, my feet moving almost of their own accord. The air in the hallway was colder than before, and the shadows seemed to stretch out longer, deeper, as I made my way down the stairs. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step I took. By the time I reached the bottom, they were all around me, echoing off the walls, filling my head with voices I didn't recognize. I stumbled into the living room, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and there it was again. "Come." The voice was louder now, clearer. It was coming from the wall behind the fireplace. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, and pressed my hand against the cold stone. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that seemed to fill the entire house. I stood there, frozen, my hand still on the wall, waiting for something to happen. And then I felt it. The stone beneath my hand shifted, ever so slightly, like something was moving behind it. I yanked my hand back, stumbling away from the fireplace. The whispers started again, louder than ever, almost frantic. I ran from the room, my footsteps echoing through the house, the whispers chasing after me, urging me to come back. But I couldn't. I locked myself in my bedroom, my back pressed against the door, my entire body trembling. The house was alive. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And I knew, deep down, that the next time the voice called me, I wouldn't be able to resist. I didn't leave my room for hours, too afraid to face whatever was waiting in the dark corners of the house. The whispers had quieted down, but the air still felt charged, thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. I knew I couldn't stay in that room forever. Whatever was in the house wouldn't stop until I confronted it. But the idea of going back to that fireplace, where the voice had been clearest, where I had felt the stone shift, filled me with dread. What was behind the wall? What was it that wanted me to come? As night fell once again, I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The stillness that had settled after the whispers had faded was even more unsettling than the voices themselves. It felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't take the suspense any longer. My thoughts raced as I paced the room, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. I told myself over and over that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that there was a rational explanation for everything. But the truth was, the house wanted me to do something I couldn't ignore anymore. Eventually, the silence broke. The whispers returned, louder than ever. They were no longer subtle, no longer quiet murmurs slipping through the walls. They were a cacophony of voices, swirling around me, growing louder with every passing second. "Come." This time, I couldn't resist. I felt my body move on its own, as if I were no longer in control. My feet carried me down the stairs, each step echoing through the house like a countdown to something I didn't understand. The whispers filled my mind, urging me forward, pushing me closer to the fireplace. When I reached the living room, the air was colder than it had ever been. I stood in front of the fireplace, my heart pounding in my chest, and the voice came again, clearer than before. "Come to me." I placed my hands on the cold stone, feeling the rough texture under my fingers. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, except for my own shallow breaths. Then, just as before, the stone shifted. This time, I didn't pull away. I pressed harder against the wall, and slowly the stone began to move. A section of the wall slid back with a heavy groan, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that seemed to descend deep into the earth. A cold wind blew from within, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell that made my stomach turn. The whispers had stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence was more terrifying than the voices had ever been. I knew, without a doubt, that I had found what the house had been hiding, and it wanted me to go inside. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the passageway. The darkness swallowed me whole, and as I descended, the air grew colder, thicker, like I was walking deeper into a nightmare. My breath echoed against the stone walls, and I could feel the weight of the house above me, pressing down as if it was watching, waiting for me to reach the end. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the earth. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, and with every step, the sense of dread grew stronger. I wanted to turn back, to run, but something compelled me to keep going. Finally, I reached the end of the passage. The air was frigid now, and my breath came out in white puffs that quickly dissipated into the darkness. In front of me was an old iron door, rusted with age. It stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling through the crack. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, barely large enough to hold the heavy stone altar that dominated the center. The walls were lined with old, crumbling tapestries, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. But what caught my attention was what lay on the altar. It was a book, a massive, leather-bound tome, its pages yellowed with age. The air around it seemed to hum with a low, unnatural energy, and I could feel it drawing me in, pulling me closer. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing in front of the altar. The book was open, its pages covered in strange symbols I couldn't understand. As I looked down at it, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my mind with voices I didn't recognize. They weren't speaking to me anymore. They were commanding me. My hands moved without my consent, reaching for the book, my fingers brushing against the worn leather. The moment I touched it, the voices stopped. And then, all at once, they screamed. A blinding light exploded from the pages, filling the room with an overwhelming, suffocating force. The air was ripped from my lungs, and I stumbled back, my hands covering my ears as the screams grew louder, more frantic. The book glowed with a violent energy, the symbols on the pages shifting, twisting, as if they were alive. I tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. The walls began to close in, the air growing thicker, heavier, until I could barely breathe. I fell to my knees, gasping for air as the voices reached a deafening crescendo. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was silent. The book lay still on the altar, its pages now blank. The whispers were gone. I stood up, my entire body trembling, and backed away from the altar. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. I had awakened something. And it was still here, watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I turned and ran from the room, my footsteps echoing down the passageway as I fled back toward the surface. The house was silent as I reached the living room, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. I could feel it watching me. The whispers may have stopped, but I knew they would return. The house had let me go this time, but I had a sinking feeling it wasn't finished with me yet.